Hey, everybody. We've got a really great show for you today. We're going to be talking about how to land your first analytics engineering role. Madison, I'd love to have you say hi to the audience and give us a little quick intro and background, if you don't mind.
Hi, I'm Madison. I am currently a senior analytics engineer at ConvertKit and the author of Learn Analytics Engineering newsletter. I started out my career as a data engineer and ended up transitioning into analytics engineering when I wanted more business exposure. I actually come from an untraditional tech background. I went to business school and kind of am self-taught in data science and data engineering, and was recruited by Capital One to do like a 6-month learning boot camp, which is how I got my in the data world, and worked as a data engineer there for 3 years before going to Wink, which was a small wine e-commerce startup, and now I'm at ConvertKit.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Madison. Here are some of the main questions that we're going to cover. We're going to be talking all about analytics engineering. And with that, Madison, I'd love to understand, you talked about transitioning from data engineering to analytics engineering. That might be a really nuanced distinction for a lot of folks. Maybe we could start kind of with that. Like, what's your day-to-day like now as an analytics engineer, and how does that differ from when you were a data engineer?
Yeah, so when I was a data engineer, I was mainly focused on DevOps and AWS infrastructure. So that was a lot different compared to what I do now. I think there's different tiers of data engineers and different ones that have different responsibilities. But compared to what I was doing before, it is very different. Right now, my day-to-day involves a lot of working with the modern data stack, a lot of data modeling in DBT, and a lot of direct communication with the business, which is something I never had as a data engineer before. I was never really focused on business value, whereas now I'm like constantly talking with stakeholders and trying to learn more about what they need and how we can better serve them, and then build data models to get them the correct data that they need. And I also focus a lot on documentation. That's something that I talk about extensively because I think it's so important and something that data people tend not to focus on because it's not the fun, glamorous thing, but it is something that is really important.
That's, yeah, super interesting. So I'm probably oversimplifying this. I'm actually just really curious about getting into this nuance as well. But it sounds almost like it's a lot of similar work to data engineering, but you have almost more of like a front end stakeholder component where it's not just about setting up the data, but like really maybe how can you proactively sort of be building the tools and enabling the specific data components that some of these business folks are going to need. Does that kind of sound about
Yeah,
right?
exactly. As a data engineer, I worked very closely with a product owner, and I think that also has to do with working for a larger enterprise company. But we were kind of just like told the things that we have to do rather than figuring out the best course of action. So a lot more problem solving for me personally as an analytics engineer for a smaller startup compared to working for a large company.
Yeah, that's fun. How many folks are in the company that you're at now, just to get a sense for folks?
Around 100.
100. Okay, yeah. So it's early, but but you guys are pretty sizable. Yeah, I've heard of
Yeah.
ConvertKit. I've actually heard great things and seen a lot of people use it. So that's really cool. That's awesome. So you mentioned a lot of stuff with DBT. What are some of the other major tools that you're using? Like, what percentage of your time is working with DBT? What percentage of time in other stuff?
Yeah, so I would say probably 70% of my time is working with DBT just because that's something that we're really focused on right now, is building our data models and the core ones that can really support the rest of the business and scale throughout. And then I work very closely with Airbyte as like a data ingestion tool we use. And then surprisingly, which I feel like this doesn't really get talked about much for analytics engineers, is our involvement with reverse ETL tools. This is something that's really important, especially if you have a company that really depends on HubSpot for a lot of their sales. I'm constantly adding new fields to DBT data models to feed into like tools like HubSpot and Intercom.
Very cool. Yeah. So again, there's like sort of that front end driven component. You've got somebody in marketing who's like, we need to start capturing this data in HubSpot. And then you're the person that's like, well, if it's going to get into HubSpot, we've got to capture it somewhere else on the back end first and feed it in there. Yeah. Really fun.
Exactly.
That's awesome. We've got a few people in the chat just saying like, what is DBT? Could you go a little more deep? A lot of the folks in our audience might be, data analysts or data scientists and not as much in the data engineering. So I would love to just get a little more, especially since it's such a big part of your wheelhouse.
Yeah, so DBT is a data transformation tool. So it essentially uses SQL and Jinja and YAML to basically modularize your code. So it does utilize SQL, which I think is a big misconception. So there's not like a huge learning curve with DBT. Like it's something that a lot of data people can really use out of the box. You just have to know the best practices to really get the power out of DBT, which again is like making your code modular. So it essentially helps you like deconstruct larger queries, separate them out into different data models, and allows you to reuse them in different parts of your DBT project. And then it also includes built-in testing and documentation, which is really powerful. So it enables data quality right where your SQL code lives.
Awesome. Yeah, it's the modularity piece is really interesting to me. And I kind of can think about my closest experience to that. A long time ago, I was at a big enterprise company, and the people who were in the analytics department were like heavy SQL users all day, every day. And you could almost say they were doing sort of like data engineering type work. They're taking these massive data sets, trying to transform them into other places and get them to the stakeholders. But there wasn't anything like DBT yet. And so what we had was like an internal wiki with like these code snippets saved, and they'd say, okay, if you want to calculate this, like here's the code block, and you'd get a bunch of these blocks together. And it sounds like DBT kind of takes that, but like does it in a grown up way that's scalable and repeatable. You know, that's awesome. Would you say if somebody's interested in learning DBT, clearly such an important part of the stack, do they need to know SQL first? Does it like make it a lot easier, or would you say like don't go to DBT if you haven't learned SQL first, or how would you think about that?
Yeah, I would say SQL is definitely the core of any data person and any of their skills. It's just something that you need to know to really work with almost any tool out there. So definitely like spending time practicing that and learning the basics like window functions, aggregates, differences between data types, how to use date fields, all of that is really important. And I think that'll only enable you to really take advantage of DBT. I think it would be a little bit difficult to learn both of them at once. But yeah, I would say like DBT is just kind of a way to take your data models and your SQL skills a step further.
Cool. I'll lay off DBT in a second, but just more questions. So it makes sense to learn SQL first. Is there any other sort of prerequisite that you would advise before somebody tries to jump into DBT, or does SQL kind of handle it for you?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Like it's really an accessible tool for any data person. That's why I'm always encouraging data analysts, data engineers to learn it, because it's really just about like adapting best practices, which are going to help you in all different areas and not just in DBT, because it is built on the core principles that just all data engineers and data people should be following.
Yeah, awesome. When you think about like the other skills that you might need, and maybe even forget about technical skills for a moment. If somebody's thinking about, okay, how do I get really good at working with the stakeholders, like from the perspective of an analytics engineer, how would you think about that? Folks are always interested in soft skills and, you know, how they can get better at those things.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is being able to communicate. It's so important. And I think it's something that is really hard to teach and something that you really need to focus on just getting better in your role. And it's something that comes with time. I wish I had an easy solution for everyone to get better at communication, but that's something that I'm always actively working on and growing. it's really important to take the technical concepts that you're talking about and communicate them in a way that stakeholders can understand. A lot of stakeholders that you're going to be dealing with aren't super technical, and you need to find the way to communicate those technical nuances in a way that they understand, and also communicating the business value. You need to remember that everything comes down to the business value. And if they're not able to understand that, you're going to have a much harder time communicating that.
Yeah, that might be the best advice you could give anybody across like any data role. And I think because it's so hard, it's like we get really excited about the data and like the technical work that we're doing and how we massage this thing. And there's these little caveats and we want to explain them. And we just start nerding out on this on the data problem. But like the head of marketing, the CEO, like they don't care about any of that. They care about how are you going to make them money or save them time or, get them more customers, make their customers more happy, those types of outcomes. And so, if you can, I like to tell people, like, forget that you have any data skills and just start thinking like the business person first, and then fill in the detail underneath with the data skills. And if you could do that, I think that's a good hack for communication. So I'm glad you went there to business value.
Yeah, I think this is also really important when it comes to data modeling, and something I try to think about a lot is like, how much can you spend working on a problem, and like what's the actual result of that? A lot of times I think it can be easy to get into the weeds trying to solve like a really particular problem. But if that particular problem is taking you like an entire week to complete, and it's only like affecting your revenue a tiny amount compared to some other project you can be working on, that's like a big thing to consider, all of the trade-offs involved in like looking at edge cases and stuff in your data.
Yep. Yeah, that's great advice. I'm curious, like, so I've been at companies where, there's been like analysts, sometimes they call it BI. Analytics engineering is, again, it's a little newer of a concept. I feel like it's a title that's evolved the past few years. I'm curious. So like in a 100-person company like yours, where does an analytics engineer sit? Like, are you part of a data team? Are you part of like the engineering team? How does that usually work?
Yeah, so at ConvertKit, we're part of the data team. There's 2 analytics engineers and 2 data analysts. And it's actually different. We sit under operations, which I think is kind of surprising. You would think that the data team would sit under engineering, but also data team is like a full service team. You're literally interacting with everyone. But I like to think of analytics engineers as, yes, like you're on a data team with the data analyst, but you're working very closely with the engineering team. And it's really important that you have that close relationship with them.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I think that for everybody in the audience, just a quick thing that is kind of breezed over here. But so Madison's saying there's 2 data engineers and 2 data analysts. And so many times companies talk about, people love to say like garbage in, garbage out. You got to focus on the quality of the data. To me, this feels like ConvertKit putting their money where their mouth is and like really prioritizing getting that foundation right with you and your counterpart. Where I think a lot of times you might have that balance, like you might be a little more strapped and there might be a lot of people who are analysts, but it's great to hear that they're prioritizing getting the data right and building that infrastructure. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's really important, and something that I see a lot, like when I first join companies and they don't have like any kind of scalable situation in place. Like DBT, for example, is super scalable and really allows you to grow, and it's something that is enabling best practices for like 10, 20 years to come. But if you're doing all of your data models in a BI tool, for example, then it's not going to be very scalable, and it's going to be much harder to have that continue on for years to come.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's again really good advice. I'm curious. I want to hear your experience in like big company versus small company, kind of how you would contrast it, how you like it personally. And I'm also, with so many folks in the audience who are trying to get a new job, I'd love to hear from you guys. Are you more interested in startups, more interested in bigger companies? Just do you not care? If you could just tell us in the chat, that would be really helpful. And yeah, Madison, love to hear you kind of contrast your experiences and how you like being at an earlier company.
Yeah, I think it's really important to honestly try both. You're never going to know what you prefer until you put yourself in both situations. Enterprise companies, larger companies like Capital One, I think they are really great for starting your career and learning because you have access to so many different resources. Like we had hackathons, we had learning days, we had like this whole platform with a bunch of educational videos that we can watch. Like it's just a really great place for constant resources, and they're really investing in your growth. But with startups and smaller companies, I think you really get a chance to like accelerate your skills once you've kind of built up that foundation. And it like really depends on what you want. I'm someone that really likes to be involved in like all different areas. So for me, that's really exciting because I get to do a bunch of things that I enjoy. Whereas larger companies, I would say it's more limited in what you can get involved with because there's typically tons of different lines of businesses and you're in like a very small section of the company.
Yeah. I think you nailed it. It's funny that you talk about the big company giving you great training and specifically like Capital One being your prototype for that. When I was back at a big company, a bunch of the analysts, probably 4 or 5 of them in our department, came from Capital One, and they were great. They were some of the most respected analysts, folks that I still keep in touch with today. And I think you totally nailed it. If you're at that big company, there's going to be lots of people to learn from. They're going to have formalized training programs. To me, like I think personally, if you're just getting started, that's the place to be. I was lucky to do the same path, go to a big company first. And then about 5 years in, I transitioned to a startup. I think the only thing I would maybe have done differently is like go to a startup maybe after 3 years. Because once I got it, I love the startup, just, same as you can really take on a whole bunch of new things. Nobody's thinking like, oh, you're not old enough to do this thing. They're just like, hey, we got to solve these problems. Where's a smart person that can take it? So just opportunity really presents itself and a lot less bureaucracy and stuff like that. So, so I think you really nailed that. That's great. How about, I'm curious. So a lot of folks here might be interested in data engineering, analytics engineering roles. Do you think having like a data analyst or data scientist role first is needed or really helps, or could you go kind of into your first data role as a data engineer? Like, what do you think about that one?
Yeah, I think it really depends on your skill set and what makes sense. Like for me, when I started as a data engineer, I actually always wanted to be a data analyst, but it was the thing that just made the most sense with my skill set. Like I come from a math degree as well as a business degree. So Capital One like saw that math degree. They're like, oh, she would make a great data engineer. So I kind of just took whatever opportunities came my way and what made sense. And I think that's a great way to do it because you're like not going to know what you enjoy and what makes most sense for you until you actually start doing it. And if that can get your foot in the door, there's more room for you to move around and take on different roles. And while I wanted to transition into analytics engineering, that data engineering foundation is what really allowed me to get that first role as an analytics engineer because I was able to play to that technical strength that maybe a lot of other analytics engineers didn't have.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And it sounds like you've got a really good skill set now of like the strong back-end technical foundation, but you're also really thinking like a business person and working with business stakeholders. So yeah, you're probably pretty secure for quite a long time. That's awesome. It's a good formula for folks who are here in the audience taking notes. How about other technical skills? I know you said like DBT is really heavy for you guys. Think about maybe like in adjacent companies that, do you think is everybody using DBT for this type of role? Are there like other competitors? What's the full sort of landscape of tools look like?
Yeah, I think DBT is really the major transformation tool. I haven't really heard of people adopting other ones unless they're just using plain SQL, kind of what you mentioned before.
Yeah.
But then in terms of other modern data stack tools, I don't think you necessarily need to master a specific tool. It's more so understanding the foundations behind each tool. So like a data ingestion tool, you have Fivetran, you have Airbyte. You don't necessarily need to master one of those, but master like the key concepts behind them. And same with like orchestration tools, again, transformation, reverse ETL, data warehousing. Like instead of focusing on like Snowflake, Redshift, focus on the concepts, and that can then be applied to any tool. Once you know those, you can pretty much apply that to anything and then learn on the job.
Cool. Awesome. I want to hear from the audience again, just to understand kind of where you guys are at in terms of trying to get a job. And if you're one of the people that already has a job, you can skip this one, but curious kind of what stage you're at, because I'd love to get into Madison's head a little bit about how to approach a job search, how to market yourself if you wanted a data engineering, analytics engineering role. So let's see. So we are, kind of mixed on this one. Already have jobs, looking for one, actively applying. Some people just kind of learning, just trying to figure out what to learn. So I think we've covered a lot of that, like sort of what to learn first. How about like, okay, you want to pick up SQL, you want to learn DBT, you want to get some exposure to business problems. Any great resources that you would recommend, or like, how would you go about actually trying to learn those skills? And you can plug yourself on here too. No shame.
Definitely recommend following all the data influencers on LinkedIn, newsletters. I think that's all super helpful. I'm actually currently running a data pipeline summer challenge right now in my newsletter. So I'm basically walking through how to create a data pipeline from scratch, going over data warehouse best practices, data ingestion, DBT, and then reverse ETL and orchestration. And I'll have challenges at the end of each of those where you can actually put what I'm teaching you and what you're learning to use. And then by the end, you'll have something that you can put on your resume and show that this is a real world project that you've done. And I'm actually using a Maven analytics data set for that. So that's
nice.
Fun.
Which data set are you using?
I believe it's the sales pipeline one.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Very cool.
So that was a super helpful resource that made my life a lot easier. I thought I was going to have to create a fake data set for that. But like taking advantage of things like that is a great opportunity. I think you really need to take everything that you read and learn, again, like on LinkedIn through newsletters, and put it into action, because that's truly the only way that you're going to learn. And you need to feel a little bit frustrated, and you need to hit roadblocks and overcome them in order to like really nail a concept.
Yeah, I think that's such good advice, because no matter how good you read like a great blog post teaching you about these concepts or watch a great video, if you're not actually getting your hands dirty, like it's going to be in one ear and out the other within 30 minutes, right? Like you really, to get, especially I just think for these technical skills, and maybe it's just me, but I think it's like everybody is, the best way is just practice it and then go like actually try to do something. And like you said, like hit that roadblock, get frustrated, have to turn to Google and ask how to do it. And then you'll remember how you figured out how to solve that problem. And the best thing about it too is kind of the more that you do that, you just sort of develop this like confidence and competence in, okay, I'm going to hit these, like whether it's like a syntax thing or I don't even know how to approach this. At first, those problems seem really big, but the more you do it, you just sort of feel like, yeah, I could do this. I can go to Google. Today you can ask ChatGPT similar things. Stack Overflow is amazing, and you just get comfortable. You realize you're going to do it all the time. So yeah, just getting going and doing projects is awesome. So how about when folks are like, okay, I've got a little bit of skills under my belt, I think I might be ready to start like trying to find jobs, apply for jobs as a analytics engineer, data engineer. What advice would you give them in terms of steps to take?
Yeah, so I think definitely make sure you have your LinkedIn filled out. I surprisingly see so many people that just have like where they've worked and nothing about what they've done. I think that is really important. And honestly, I would recommend just like starting to be more active on a place like LinkedIn, especially if you're about to find a job. I think it's always good to post like what you're doing on LinkedIn because that helps build your network. But
Yeah.
by posting, especially around your job search, you are definitely gaining more eyes on your profile and more people that might be interested. And that's something that recruiters definitely look at.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I feel like the way I'd say it too is you're never going to get hired without somebody looking at your LinkedIn. You know, like it's just part of the process. They're going to be like, "Hey, is there any weird red flags with her? Oh, does she? Oh yeah, no, this." And they like if they look at yours, Madison, they're going to be like, "Wow, she talks about this all the time. She clearly loves data engineering, analytics engineering." Like that would be a huge green flag, right? And
Yeah.
that's what you want. You want them to get this confirmation that, yep, she's the person we're looking for, versus the other, you know, if it's just like totally not filled out, that's a little weird. If it looks like you're something else, you know, like if it looks like, hey, you're going for a data engineering role and it looks like you fit some other persona perfectly, that's also kind of a big red flag. So make sure
Mhm.
you look like that. Um, After
Yeah.
LinkedIn, what else would you tell people?
I mean, I always recommend, again, like posting
Yeah.
and taking advantage of your connections. I think a lot of people are afraid to message people they either worked with in the past or that they think they might have an open role. I am always messaging on LinkedIn. That's actually how I got my first role as an analytics engineer. Of course, I applied like through LinkedIn, but I messaged the hiring manager and I think I sent him some of the articles I had written and like why he should take a chance on me and why I'd be the perfect person. And that's something that he mentioned when he called me for an interview. He said, "Yeah, I was really impressed by your message. Like that definitely stood out, showed me that you're really passionate about the company." So always like going the extra step, it really goes far. And like I always thought people sent thank you notes. I thought that that was just like a thing people do. But then I started interviewing people for like past companies and it's really something nobody does. So even just
Yeah.
like sending a thank you message can really go a long way.
It can, yeah. And so again, amazing advice here. I love how you shot your shot and it worked. You know, you got this job. And I think that there's a little nuance in here that I want to call out to the audience. So, um, Madison, you said like, hey, here's some articles. Here's why you should take a chance on me. Like you really made it a pitch and you brought the value that you can bring to the front of that conversation versus
Mhm.
like, I get messages all the time that's like, hey, are there any jobs? You know, and it's like,
Yeah.
I'm not going to respond to that. It's not, there's nothing I can do with that message, right? I get too many of them. But if somebody came and they're like, these are the things that I can do, and this is a project that I did and how it applies to your business, that's somebody that at least like, I'm probably going to talk to that person and maybe keep them warm. Maybe it's for, even if I'm not hiring, maybe I know somebody who is or somebody else. So like definitely that's really good advice. Shoot your shot, but like do it in that strong way where you're pitching yourself and it makes all the difference. So awesome.
Yep.
And I'd love to, like, you've gotten pretty active on LinkedIn and you've got your newsletter. Like, how has that helped your career trajectory? Have you noticed anything different since kind of starting doing that?
Yeah, that's helped so much. I actually got my job at ConvertKit because the hiring manager was familiar with my content and wanted to interview me. I wasn't even looking for a role at the time, and it just kind of fell in my lap and it ended up perfectly. And I get a lot of messages from companies that are looking to hire analytics engineers. And I think I'm always someone that comes top of mind because I've kind of established myself as an expert in this area. So putting yourself out there, it really just puts you on people's minds. And if you're establishing yourself as an expert in an industry, people are automatically going to think of you when it comes to open roles at their company and referrals. And it really just gives you a leg up because referrals are the best way to get any job. You already have a leg in. You don't have to depend on someone searching through hundreds of resumes and hoping that yours stands out from the rest.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's anytime I always say in the job market, it's so much better to be hunted than to have to go out and hunt. You know, just the
Yeah.
dynamic is so different. If it's like think of most people on this audience, you're thinking about like, hey, I got to hit the apply button and I'm filling in this thing, and I'm kind of thinking nobody's really reading my application or responding to it, and it's pretty frustrating. Versus like, imagine me coming and saying like, hey, Madison, we've got this analytics engineering role open. I think it would be perfect for you. And I'm going to pitch you on the company a little bit to try to convince you to do it. You know, like so much better if you can do that. And obviously there's a lot of work. You've built a brand, you're sharing a lot of stuff out there, but always just so much better to be hunted. And one little piece on that, like you've established expertise and you're sharing all this stuff. I've seen people even like at the very beginning stages of their journey, when they're just learning, putting their stuff out there and documenting it and saying like, hey, I'm not an expert. That's not the expert persona, but the learner persona. And people can still get noticed because of that and get jobs because of that. We've got students that have come to us and they say like, yeah, this was the best thing I ever did, was just like getting active in the community on LinkedIn and sharing the work I was doing. And same thing, like they get their job because a hiring manager reaches out and says, hey, I've seen some of your stuff. I've seen like how much you've been progressing, and like, let's talk about a role. So you don't have to be, you don't have to be Madison, the expert. You can do it, start earlier on, you know?
And I wasn't an expert when I started writing either. I was doing exactly that. I was learning about analytics engineering as I went and sharing everything I was learning in the process. And that just made me a better teacher, made me a better analytics engineer, because it's a lot harder to write about something than it is to read it, and like making sure people can actually understand what you're saying. And I think I read a statistic recently, and it was like, posting once a month on LinkedIn, you are still posting more than like 99% of people. So even if you don't post like super often, just share like once a month something that you're working on, and that can go really far.
Yeah. So another thing is, one of the folks here in the audience said they actually have an analytics engineering interview later today. And they were curious, like, what kind of questions do you think somebody would be asking in an analytics interview? And congrats on getting that interview.
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with your past experience and how you've solved problems in the past. And it's also going to depend on the problems that the company is currently struggling with. I think a lot of the interviews I've had in the past were focused on data quality and building out a data stack, because DBT wasn't very established or established at all when I joined in both of my analytics engineering roles. So that was a big thing. Like, how have you built out DBT in the past? How have you fixed these specific problems? Like, what's the first thing you would do to create the most impact? And a lot of things focused on data quality. Honestly, I think that's a big thing. If a team doesn't have a dedicated analytics engineer, chances are there's a lot of bad data that you're going to have to work with and fix, but put best practices in place.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, we struggle with that specific thing. Like, we've got at Maven, we've got a team of a lot of people who are analysts. Nobody's really kind of owns the analytics engineering, is sort of owned by committee. And let's just say maybe that might not be the way we do it forever, because I think it's probably better to have some dedicated resources there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. Do you usually end up in an interview? Are there like case studies? Are they having you go through actual like technical coding? Like, how does that usually work?
Yeah. So I've always had take home problems, whether it's like a SQL take home or even live SQL challenges. But then like a more strategic one, usually with like data modeling, and what you would put in place to ensure like data models are coming out as expected, and like working through some of the edge cases in that company's specific data. A lot of times the company will give you a problem that they've been working on themselves and to see how you can solve it.
Yeah, and sometimes that can be like a fun way to get into like the actual type of work that you might be doing. You get a little bit of a preview from that.
Yeah.
Um, cool, cool. Yeah. Any tips on like if you're in an interview, what's something that you would like really want to make sure that you get across about yourself? Or it could be a few things, whatever you think. Like, what do you want that interviewer to take away?
So, first, I think it's really important that you love to learn. I forgot to mention that as a soft skill, but we've kind of touched on that a little bit. Um, in any data career, like things are constantly changing. It's not a role that has stayed the same for like the last 30 years. Like you constantly have to be learning something new. And if you're not adapting with the changing landscape, you're kind of falling behind. So that's something I always emphasize, is that I'm not afraid to take on a project that I don't know much about, because I can eventually overcome it and learn something new to add to my toolbox. And then what I've seen, I guess, a lack of in my time interviewing people is that a lot of people don't explain their thought process behind things. They kind of just explain the solution that they come to, but not how they got to that solution. And I think that's a big gap in interviews, because a lot of times the person interviewing doesn't necessarily care about the end solution. They care about your thought process and why you think that's a good solution. And that's especially important in like SQL interviews or data models. Like even if you're struggling through a SQL interview, if you're explaining what you're thinking and why you're struggling, that will get you a lot further. I actually had one interview where I thought I did awful because it was like a Python algorithm coding interview, but I just walked through like what I was doing and why, and maybe some things that I didn't learn, but that I would Google if I had the chance. And I ended up getting an offer. And that was kind of shocking, but it just shows like how far just explaining your thought process can take you.
Yeah, no, that's great. I go back to my experience on the hiring manager side. And when I'm interviewing somebody, whether it's like a technical interview or like a more of like a business case study, one of the worst things that can happen for that person is if they're just quiet and they're like not walking through the process. And then if they're talking out loud and they're explaining their assumptions, and because that's like, I want to understand, how does their mind work? That's really, really important. And then it also gives them an opportunity to communicate these assumptions and the nuances to me. And so just talking out how you're thinking is like, it's such good advice you're giving there. It really is good.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think everyone expects you to know everything. A lot of times it can be easy. Like even a SQL function, like I forget them. Like it's just an easy thing to Google. So if you can like communicate that in an interview, the interviewer will understand. Like everyone uses Google.
I Google syntax that I have taught in recorded courses to tens of thousands of people. Like it's just part of the job. It's what you do.
Yep.
So that's, never feel guilty for Googling syntax. A funny little anecdote, when you say like, it felt like the interview wasn't going great. My anecdote there that's kind of along those lines is I went to an interview and I was getting grilled, and 3 out of the 4 people I thought I did great with, one of them was just beating me up, and like it was really hard, and I couldn't get the guy to smile, and I'm like, man, that last guy, I tanked it, and I thought I was done. And then the next day I get a call back from the recruiter and they say, this guy, he wants you to be on his team. And what this was like a very early, one of my first interviews out of school. And what I realized is, if the interview is like really soft and they're not grilling you very hard, they've probably given up and like they're just trying to end it nicely. If they're going like really hard and trying to dig into you and push you, and it feels like you're getting beat up, like don't get discouraged, because they probably really like you at this point, and they're trying to see how much they like you and how far you can go, which was super counterintuitive to me as like a 22-year-old trying to get a job. I was like, I tanked this thing, and it ended up being that was the job I got. So let's get into some of these questions. The folks have been pretty good about adding them here. So let's see. So so this one, I think you've covered some of this stuff already, but this is from Venkata. Graduated last month. I want to get into data engineering. Can you please give a clear roadmap for the manner of acquiring the skill sets? Like, what would you advise Venkata does today and like in the first couple months?
Yeah, so I actually have a whole newsletter about this, or a whole email on this on my newsletter. So definitely check that out. But I think it is important to be strategic about it and actually plan what you want to learn. So like go through and make a list of maybe where the gaps in your skills are, and then collect some resources that will help you learn those, and then maybe find a project to also apply it, and plan this all out in a schedule. I think the biggest thing is that people have a goal, but they don't actually realize how much time it might take to learn these skill sets and reach that goal. But by giving yourself a strict schedule and a strict timeline of like reviewing the resources, actually applying them, it'll allow you to reach your goal a lot faster.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. Trying to give yourself some sort of accountability and like kind of put some deadlines there, try to time box it. That's awesome. And
Yep.
For folks who are interested in Madison's newsletter, I dropped a link in the chat. I think there might be some other folks that do analytics engineering, but I think there's tons of content around data analysts and data scientists, but not as much around data engineering and analytics engineering. So if you guys are looking for that, definitely check out the newsletter and follow Madison on LinkedIn. You'll get a lot of good stuff. Let's jump into another one. Let's see. Here's another good one. So this is from Tabo. I'm working as an analyst, but want to transition to analytics engineering. Since there are no analytics engineering roles, I'm guessing they're saying in the company, convince my manager to allow me to transition to data engineering over a couple of months. Do you think this is a good approach to eventually get into analytics engineering?
Yeah, so I think if you're currently working as a data analyst or a data engineer, and especially if there's no analytics engineer, there's definitely room to take on analytics engineering projects in addition to your data analyst work. So while your title might not officially be an analytics engineer, you can gain experience with projects. So like if you're coding all of your queries in a BI tool, for example, maybe you can introduce DBT to your team and figure out a way to move a lot of those queries into reusable data models. And then that's not only helping your data analyst work, but it's also taking on an analytics engineering project that you can then put on your resume or use as more of a reason why you should transition into analytics engineering. And same with data engineering. If you want to take on a project like ingesting a new data source, for example, using like a tool like Airbyte, that's something that you can learn while you're in that role, and then again use that to apply to hopefully an analytics engineering role in the future.
Yeah, that's awesome. So, I mean, I think two major components of that answer is one, there's a good amount of overlap between the roles so you can still kind of learn, even if it's not your end state role, you can learn it. And then two, I love that you said if they don't have an analytics engineer, somebody needs to kind of be doing that stuff, and you might just start doing it. You know, it's like when we have folks that want to become a data analyst, and they might be like a marketing person, and you know, sometimes that side door strategy of just like, hey, the company has data, they have data analytics needs, just kind of start doing it and like be that person. Don't wait until you have the title. I love that. I love that advice. It's really good. Here's one that might be a little nuanced, and I'm curious what you would say about this. But so this is from Grace, and Grace says, what's the difference between a business intelligence engineer and an analytics engineer? Is that just company A versus company B in the same role, or is there sort of some distinction?
Yeah, so this is another thing. I have a specific article all on like comparing the exact skill sets and everything. I think the big thing with a BI engineer is that they're very focused on like that BI tool rather than taking things out of the BI tool, and maybe less focus on other parts of the data pipeline like orchestration or data ingestion. I would say that's like the main difference. So I would say less data engineering, and that's like closer to a data analyst than an analytics engineer.
Yeah, so you almost might, for the business intelligence engineer, you almost might call them a Power BI engineer or a Tableau engineer, or something like that. Yeah.
Yep.
I think that's I think that checks out for me. That's a great distinction there. Let's see. So I think it'd still be good to get into this. This is from Leandra. I know you covered this a little bit at the beginning, but data analyst versus analytics engineering, kind of like where do those two overlap or not at all, and like where do they have differing scope and function?
Yeah, so analytics engineers, I like to think that they focus on the whole pipeline. So the moment from your data being ingested to it being transformed to being orchestrated, whereas data analysts are mainly writing queries on top of the data models that analytics engineers build to do like dashboards, reports, and directly serve stakeholders. Whereas the analytics engineers are really focusing on making the quality of the data that these analysts use really high and creating reusable data models that can scale. And then also documentation. I think I spend a lot of time just like looking at the raw data and documenting that.
Just trying to explain like, what is this? What are caveats, nuances? Where does it come from? What does it mean? All that stuff. Yeah. Awesome.
Yep.
Yeah. I think you nailed it. And I definitely fit the data analyst role. Like I want to have good data and use it to influence business decisions. I personally, it's not my jam to like doing the technical work, but I really appreciate when there is somebody that does, so I know I can trust the data and it's getting to where it needs to be. So I think it's a really important partnership that, and like you said at ConvertKit, you're 2 and 2 with 2 data analysts and 2 data engineers, and together, you can get everything built, you can action on it and help the business. So yeah, that's awesome. Let's see. What else do we have here? Good questions in here. How about for somebody who is a Power BI developer, what kind of tools would you recommend for data warehousing and data modeling? And maybe, I'm guessing we're saying outside of Power BI, like what else might they learn next to get into more analytics engineering?
Yeah, so in terms of data warehouse, like I said earlier, I don't think it necessarily matters the type of tool, although I do find Snowflake was a good one to start out with, just because I think it's a lot less maintenance than something like Redshift, a lot easier to learn best practices, and there's tons of resources out there on Snowflake. Definitely recommend taking advantage of the free trial that they offer to just play around and focus on like learning some of their features, like how to create users, roles, cost management. What does it even mean with the warehouse? What do the different warehouse sizes mean? All of that is really great to learn, maybe focusing on like different environments, dev versus prod, and how you would configure those. And then in terms of data modeling, again, you can use a tool like DBT, but you can also improve your data modeling skills just by using SQL. And I think the big thing with that is focusing on making your queries less specific and making them more general so that they can serve a bunch of different use cases. So like instead of writing one to calculate a specific metric for a specific dashboard, think, how can I join a bunch of different tables together and transform it so that they can serve multiple different use cases downstream? And that'll help you a lot with data modeling.
Yeah, that's awesome. And you're thinking about enabling a bunch of other people with this one thing or a bunch of different use cases. I love that advice. That's awesome. You're killing this hot seat session here. So great job. This is one I'm really interested in here. So this is from Leon. What kind of documentation do you work with as an analytics engineer besides like DBT's built-in tools? Do you use things like Confluence or like maybe any other kind of like wiki type things to keep track of business requirements, changes to data assets, lineage?
Yeah, so we use DBT Cloud, so that kind of takes care of the lineage portion of things, and that's super helpful whenever you're making code changes to just see what that's going to impact downstream. And another thing with DBT has something called exposures, where you can track dependencies in the BI tool directly within the DBT documentation. And that's something that's also super helpful because it can typically be kind of like a black box figuring out what data model changes will impact reports and dashboards in the BI tool. In addition, I use Notion to keep track of reverse ETL documentation. While I have those models documented in DBT, I've found that stakeholders just don't really tend to use that documentation. So I documented like all of our different reverse ETL syncs and the exact fields that we're mapping from our DBT data model to like HubSpot, for example. And that's been really helpful with stakeholders. It prevents a lot of questions and it ends up saving me time. That's something that I think people don't realize is like when you document things, you can just point stakeholders to the documentation and then that ends up saving like all these little ad hoc questions that they want to ask you. But I do think it's a hard thing with documentation. Like you don't want it to be dispersed to too many different places because then it just ends up getting out of sync with one another and you don't know which one to depend on. So that's why I like DBT, because I think you can document most things there. It's just a matter of like getting stakeholders to adopt that.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. Amazing. I love the idea of like trying to centralize it, because if it's all over the place, it gets unwieldy. And I also love the idea of like you're avoiding these redundant conversations and explaining the same thing over and over again by doing a little bit of extra work. And even like, to me, I don't know if this is the same in your analytics engineering world, but for me, as thinking like SQL code that I'm using today, I might write it and I might implement a process that we have. And 2 years later, I'm going to go and modify it. I hope that I wrote some comments in there to explain some of the things that I'm thinking there, right? Because like 2 years, I will not even remember having written this. And so sometimes the documentation can help you too, at least in the way I work, but you're probably similar for you as well.
Absolutely.
There was a really good question here. So this is from Venkata. Venkata says, what should be the skills that I should majorly focus on, and what are skills that I can be just familiar? I think of like the T-shaped distribution of skill set, where, you know, you want to be generally familiar with a broad set of things, but then there's like a couple cornerstones that you want to go really deep on. For that, like how would you describe kind of like the perfect T-shaped skill set for an analytics engineer? I think you'd say DBT, because it just seems like that's phenomenal. What else?
SQL, DBT, and then anything involving data quality. Again, like that's super important. Just like knowing how to test your data and the different things to look out for. Again, like I use DBT as a testing tool and along with different packages, but there's a bunch of different options out there for understanding that. And yeah, I think the cool thing about analytics engineering is that not everything is like the same. Not every role is the same. Like there are some companies that will emphasize one thing over another, and that really adds a lot of opportunity to learn different things and get different types of roles.
Awesome. Amazing. Thank you, Madison. You did an amazing job on this. I feel like I learned a ton. I'm sure that the folks did. Guys in the chat, please give Madison some love here. Say thanks for an amazing job, and thanks to you guys all for being really active in the chat and in the questions. It's much more fun when we have an engaged group like this. So thanks everybody. Thanks, Madison. We'd love to do this again with you in the future. You're fantastic.
Thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.